All right, let's talk about DNA Center. It's kind of one of Cisco's fancy new tools. But what is it? I've heard DNA, the digital network architecture, network intuitive, so many different things. Network intuitive. No, I'm not going to write that. So there's all this buzz. Whoops. Oh no. So there's all this buzz, and I want to know what that's about. So DNA, first part, digital network architecture, is kind of Cisco's customized version of software-defined networking. So SDN came out 2012, 2013, and it was a great idea, right? I've got all these switches. I've got a core switch. I've got access layer switch. Maybe I've got a switch that sits here in the middle in distribution. And I've got other things that I've got to control. I've got access points. Beep, beep, beep. I've got a wireless controller that controls all of my access points. That seemed like a good idea. I have 100 different access points. And why don't I centrally control them with one wireless LAN controller? I got routers that hang off this, right? And then there's my users sitting down here. I got a PC. We'll say green is the finance department. But I'm a manufacturing company, and there's a bunch of servers over here that are dedicated to their databases. I have to log all the different parts that come into the system, where and who has access to those. So the trouble is, do I really want my finance team to be able to access this database? Actually, let's back up. So step number one is just building this network. I got a bunch of switches to deploy. I got a bunch of APs to deploy. I got a bunch of routers to deploy. So one of the promises of software-defined networking was centralized control. A lot of the intelligence from this software that goes into the network is all dictated by your applications. And so the applications get to say to the network what security parameters they have, who should be prioritized, one application over the other. And we could install some pretty lightweight switches that had really low intelligence or low configuration and reduce the time that it would take to implement this network, right? Now I'm just sending kind of a general box out to each of these locations. And so the install becomes much easier. Easier install. And then because I have all this centralized control and my applications can dictate what it is or how I want packets to be sent across the network, actual management becomes easier install, easier management. Management becomes a lot easier too. Now, of course, there were a couple problems with SDN. One, we had trouble agreeing on all those ties in to the infrastructure that we were going to do. And then once you give everyone license to have control over the infrastructure, we got in arguments over who would be prioritized. I've got an application that I wrote. I think it's the most important application in the world. It should be prioritized. You've got an application that you wrote. You think it's the most important application in the world. It should be prioritized. And so we had trouble agreeing. And since the applications are driving the security of the network, we kind of lost control, or at least the enterprise did. So Cisco said, well, you know what, that's a good idea. I like the idea of centralized control. I like the idea of making things easier to manage, but this SDN thing is not working out. It just needs to go away. So let's try something a little bit different. Let's try the digital network. Still has elements of software control, still has elements of that centralized control, but rather than giving that power to our applications, we hold that power close for the enterprise. So they are releasing the DNA Center controller. And just like we've had a wireless LAN controller that controls all of my access points, whether it's 1 or 100, now I'm going to have a controller that controls all of my network, whether it's 1 device or 100. So I've given myself, again, centralized control. But now it's my control. It's not my vendor's particular application. I'm not fighting the finance application over the file server's application, over the engineering's application, over the student's application. It's up to the business. It's up to the enterprise to make decisions. They have the control to do that. So now that we've got centralized control, we can do some cool things with that. And we start to go back to this whole idea of being software defined. I'm going to build some applications. So you go into DNA Center today, and step 1 in the software package they've built is to design. And I go through and I start to design what I want my network to look like. Now, a lot of times this will be recapturing what your network already looks like. I'm going to put in different things like location. Right? So there's a hierarchy to it. You're in the US, you're in Indiana, you're in Indianapolis. And I've got a building on Washington Street. And then I can go in and detail that building with maps and drawings and start to build out where my IDFs are. I'm building a network management. I'm designing how I want to view my network from a high-level perspective. Now I can go and start to define other things. For this location, or maybe I define it globally for all locations, I have a logging server. I might have an authentication, an authorization, or our AAA server. I'm going to set up specific DHCP and DNS servers. And all this information gets built into DNA Center. All right, so now that I've got all those tie-ins, I can do a bunch with the different software applications. I can centrally control my network. And that's good, but that opens up new ways to use the network. And that's where the intuitive part comes in. So let's build ourselves a network. I've got a router that goes up to my WAN provider. I've got the internet sitting over here and a firewall. I've got a core switch, maybe a couple distribution switches. They go out to some access layer in the closets. This is a bit to set up. Probably got some access points hanging off here. And my switches. I need a wireless LAN controller. All right, I built my network. So what makes this intuitive? Well, I mean, one of the frustrations for so long is that people expect my network to be kind of plug and play. But that's not the case, right? I have VLANs, that builds segmentation. Maybe I do that just to control traffic. We're worried about broadcast storms. And so we utilize VLANs to try and group devices where we can apply certain policies to them. And that means every time somebody plugs in, if they're on port 1, I'm going to need to know who they are and what VLAN they should belong to. But if they pick up and they move and they go over to this switch, I got to reconfigure that switch again. Well, now I've got centralized control, so that helps. I can easily push that down, but it's still not automated. It's still not intuitive. DNA wants to take that. Let's get rid of VLANs. Let's actually do a plug and play style of networking. So I install my DNA Center controller, and I'm going to build something called, instead of VLANs, let's talk about software defined access. Or SD access. You'll see it referred to a lot of times. So all of this, I'm going to leave the firewall out because that's separate for now, gets turned into something called the fabric. And under the hood, that's VXLAN and LIS. We can go into that later. But there's certain protocols that run. I have DNA Center. I have ICE, Cisco's Identity Services Engine, network access control, that when you plug into the network, you're automatically assigned a particular group that you belong to. And using DNA Center, I've got control of all my switches, of all my access points where people are connecting wirelessly, right? So now out of this, I build, we're going to call them security, or maybe just scalable groups. What do those look like? Well, I've got admin at my office, so they're going to get assigned a group. I've got the financial people. They're going to get assigned a group. I've got HR. I've got the IT staff. Maybe I'm a school. I've got teachers. I've got students. I've got more devices. I've got TVs. I've got printers. And the sky's the limit on any more IoT devices that come into my network. So I can build policies. All right, let me start with this. I can define groups, and all of this can be, merged from Active Directory. I get those groups into my fabric, and then wherever I get those groups into ICE, which talks with DNA Center, which pushes all that information down to the fabric, which means that anytime somebody connects, anywhere they connect, whether they're financial, whether they're HR, they can come in anywhere. And we finally have a truly plug-and-play network, or your IT. the policies, and those policies can be a few different things. I've run out of room here. We always think of policies as security. Where can you go? What can you do? But what about performance? Maybe it's the end of the month and finance is going through a payroll process. And we want to make sure that their packets get where they're going. Maybe this security is time-based. We can set up any number of policies between these groups. And it doesn't matter what their IP address is. It doesn't matter what their VLAN they happen to be a part of. It doesn't matter where they've connected, whether it's wired in building A or wired in building B or wireless in building C. Now, the policy follows them wherever they plug in consistently and reliably.